The transatlantic slave trade is one of the most horrific and shameful parts of human history. From 1525 to 1866, an estimated 2.5 million African people were forcibly removed from their homes and shipped halfway across the world to endure lives of brutality and abuse as slaves in the New World. Before they even reached the New World, however, 1 in 5 died because of the horrific conditions aboard the ships that took them across the ocean. We couldn't possibly sum up the tragedy of the transatlantic slave trade in one video, and it would be insulting to try, but today we're going to take a little look at life aboard one of these slave ships and the horrifying truth of what innocent African people endured because of the slave trade. Across the hundreds of years of the slave trade, the design on slave ships changed as technology advanced. But today, the prevailing image of a slave ship is that of the large cargo ships known as Guinea men, so named because a lot of the human trafficking and forced slavery took place on the Guinea coast of West Africa. They would cram slaves onto these ships in their hundreds to endure hellish conditions on their way across the ocean to the Americas. Before even setting sail, they would strip the captured African people of their clothing and shave their heads before shoving them on deck to live in temporary wooden structures until the crew were ready to set sail. But the nightmare was just beginning. After they had rounded up hundreds of African people to sell, they were ready to set sail. They'd force their captives below deck in preparation to endure a journey that many would not survive. Usually, the majority of captured slaves, around 2/3, were men, but there were also women and children on the ships. They were kept separate from the men, above deck and unchained, but forced to endure rape and sexual abuse by members of the crew. As a result, some female slaves even entered the New World pregnant, thanks to the abuse they received on board the ships. The men suffered in different but just as horrific ways. Packed below deck in their hundreds, they found themselves in tiny spaces often no bigger than their own bodies. These cramped compartments or shelves would vary in height depending on the ship, with the smallest just 10 inches high and the tallest still below 5 feet, far too small for a fully grown man to be able to move or even sit up. Shackled to their fellow captives at all times, the men were forced to lie end to end in these dark, tiny spaces and stay like this for the entire time it took to complete the journey, which could stretch from weeks to months. They were granted 1 hour a day on deck for exercise and to be hosed down in a poor attempt at sanitation. But this was not a kindness by the crew, merely a jailer ensuring their prisoner survived the journey. Disease was one of the primary killers aboard the slave ships. The men, lying in such cramped spaces, had no sanitation provisions or designated spaces for their bathroom needs. If they vomited, which was common from seasickness, they would have no way to clean themselves. And if they needed the bathroom, they had to relieve themselves where they were and lay for hours in their own feces and urine. This led to diseases running rampant. On slave ships, there were regular outbreaks of sicknesses like dysentery, smallpox, malaria, yellow fever, influenza, and measles. It's little wonder that so many died due to these horrific conditions, and those who did survive were weakened and sickly, receiving little food to help build up their strength. The slaves aboard the ships were lucky to receive 2 meals a day, and only after ensuring there was enough food for the crew. They would receive small, paltry portions of rice and beans, accompanied by a liter of water, the bare minimum to survive. The conditions and the pain the African people endured is something that is incredibly hard to comprehend by people today. The psychological and physical torture, punishment, and abuse is so horrific that many tried to end their lives by jumping overboard or starving themselves. But a lost slave was a lost payday for the captain, so their captors didn't grant them this release. Slaves that tried to starve themselves were held down, their mouths forced open with a tool called a speculum aurum, and force-fed. They were harshly punished for any attempts at suicide or any perceived infraction. A favorite method of torture was the use of thumbscrews and the cat of 9 tails, a multi-tailed whip which was designed to cause the maximum amount of pain possible by brutally lacerating the victim's skin. Some crews would even pour sea salt into the wounds of the most defiant slaves, causing unbearable agony. This meant that even the strongest slaves were weakened by sickness, starvation, and dehydration, and any attempted rebellion that might have occurred was unlikely to succeed. And speaking of rebellions, revolts on slave ships were often orchestrated by the women, as their position above deck allowed them a freedom of movement the men didn't have. Sadly, they usually weren't successful, and the ringleaders were punished harshly. Here and there, though, a rebellion succeeded, and some Africans escaped the life of slavery waiting for them in the New World. The most famous rebellion of all was aboard the ship La Amistad. Towards the end of the transatlantic slave trade period, in 1839, slaves aboard La Amistad rose up against their captors. 53 African slaves successfully took over the ship, killing the cook and the captain, but sparing the navigator's life so he could sail them home. Instead, the navigator directed them northward until the rebel ship was seized by the US Navy. In a surprising turn of events, however, the US court eventually ruled on the side of the slaves, saying they did not deserve to have been captured. It was a landmark moment in the abolition of slavery. But across the 3 centuries of the transatlantic slave trade, too many African people were helpless in the face of the ships that took them. And for those that survived the hellish journey across the Atlantic, what awaited them once on port was no better. Torn from their families and sold into a life of servitude to cruel and torturous white people, many wished their journey had ended on the ships that carted them to their new nightmare. And now, for something more cheerful. If you like our Day in the Life of series, don't forget to subscribe and check out our newest video here.